The cost of government is due to grow from 20% of our economy to 40% of our economy. A budget that ensured that government did not grow beyond the historical standard of 20%. And unfortunately, I believe that budget was ignored. And since that budget was ignored, what were the old annual deficits under Republicans have now become the monthly deficits under Democrats. Spending is necessary. The national debt recession. Many of us believe, frankly, it's part of the problem, not part of the solution, but I understand and I respect your view. But this is what I don't understand. Triple the national debt over the next 10 years. Surely you don't believe 10 years from now we will still be mired in this almost 24.5% of the economy. Now, very soon, Mr. President, you're due to submit a new budget. And my question is...
Jim, I know there's a question in there somewhere, because you're making a whole bunch of assertions, half of which I disagree with, and I'm having to sit here listening to them. At some point, I know you're going to let me answer.
The conservative newspaper, The Washington Times, had a big feature on this today. Politico has reported on it as well, calling what the Republicans are doing here a cash and trash strategy. The blog Think Progress has done yeoman's work tallying up all the Republicans who have done this and posting pictures of them handing out the giant checks representing funds that these politicians voted against, even though they're now taking credit for handing it over. Even the president has called out Republicans for attending ribbon cuttings for stimulus-funded projects that they voted against.
I have to point out, though, that some of the very same folks in Congress who opposed the Recovery Act and claim that it hasn't worked have been all too happy to claim credit for Recovery Act projects and the jobs those projects have produced. They come to the ribbon cuttings and they found a way to have their cake and vote against it, too.
The White House has put some of the documentation of Republican hypocrisy on this in writing. None of this is a secret, which is the most important thing to understand about it. Republicans right now do not care about policy.
I want to challenge you a little bit. When President Obama came into office, we were losing jobs at a horrendous rate. We're going to throw up a graphic right behind us. You can't see it, but I'm sorry for that. But you've seen these numbers before. It's that curve that shows how many jobs we were losing. Until President Obama came into office, 700,000 a month. He passed a stimulus. He got the government geared up. We are now creating jobs. And yet you have been intensely critical. President Bush, we went over the cliff. We were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs. President Obama, a stimulus package that by all economic accounts has worked. What is your answer to the charge? You're playing politics. You're now the candidate of no. You've said that yourself.
Nancy Pelosi noted this week that 200 bills have passed the House that have been sitting in the Senate not going nowhere, and 70% of those, more than 70% of those, had more than 50 Republican votes when they passed the House, is a key of what's going wrong. There's a real problem in the Senate.
What was wrong with what President Obama did in the stimulus, which a third of which was a tax cut as requested by the Republican Party?
Well, I would say, Elliot, I don't know where the consensus is that it worked. The administration said we had to borrow $1 trillion in the stimulus bill or unemployment would reach 8%. It's now more than 9.5% across the country. It clearly has not worked, and that's because this administration didn't learn the lessons of the last administration, and that is you can't borrow and spend with deficits and debt your way back to a growing economy. Look,
Congressman, when you say it hasn't worked, when President Obama came into office, we were losing jobs at a clip of 700,000 a month. We now have positive job growth. And so how can you say that hasn't worked when the policies of President Bush, where the curve was going straight down, we turned that around 180 degrees. How can you possibly say that hasn't worked?
Well, again, I think the administration said that we needed to spend $1 trillion in the stimulus bill or unemployment would go to 8%. It's 9.5%. It's now, I think last month, Elliot, we're now at 9.5% or higher for the longest time in succession since the Great Depression.
By which I mean they will not vote for things that even they admit are good policies.
Jim, with all due respect, I've just got to take this last question as an example of how it's very hard to have the kind of bipartisan work that we're going to do, because the whole question was structured as a talking point for running running a campaign. Now, look, let's talk about the budget once again, because I'll go through it with you line by line. The fact of the matter is that when we came into office, the deficit was $1.3 trillion. 1.3. So when you say that suddenly I've got a monthly budget that is higher than the annual, or a monthly deficit that's higher than the annual deficit left by the Republicans, that's factually just not true. And you know it's not true.
You know, the American people, I tell you, we've been to 13 cities outside of Washington on the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour. They are absolutely starved for two things: the truth and leadership.
What is true is that we came in already with a $1.3 trillion deficit before I had passed any law. What is true is we came in with $8 trillion worth of debt over the next decade. Had nothing to do with anything that we had done. It had to do with the fact that in 2000, when there was a budget surplus of $200 billion.
Tonight I come before you to announce that the federal deficit will be simply zero.
Well, those days are gone.
You had a Republican administration and a Republican Congress, and we had 2 tax cuts that weren't paid for. You had a prescription drug plan, the biggest entitlement plan, by the way, in several decades, that was passed.
With one stroke of the pen, Walker says the federal government increased existing Medicare obligations nearly 40% over the next 75 years.
We'd have to have $8 trillion today invested at Treasury rates to deliver on that promise.
And how much do we have?
Zip.
Without it being paid for.
The problem with Medicare, Walker says, is people keep living longer and medical costs keep rising at twice the rate of inflation. But instead of dealing with the problem, he says the President and the Congress made things much worse just 3 years ago when they expanded the Medicare program to include prescription drug coverage.
The prescription drug bill was probably the most fiscally irresponsible piece of legislation since the 1960s. The
Why?
imbalance, well, because we promised way more that we can afford to keep. $8 trillion added to what was already a $15 to $20 trillion underfunding. We're not being realistic. We can't afford the promises we've already made, much less to be able to piling on top of them.
You had 2 wars that were done through supplementals. And then you had $3 trillion projected because of the lost revenue of this recession. That's $8 trillion. Now, we increased it by $1 trillion because of the spending that we had to make on the stimulus. I am happy to have any independent fact checker out there take a look at your presentation versus mine in terms of the accuracy of what I just said. Now, going forward, here's the deal.
We've gone from surpluses to huge deficits, and our long-range situation is much worse.
If we do not move swiftly to sign the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act into law, an economy that is already in crisis will be faced with catastrophe. This is not my assessment. This is not Nancy Pelosi's assessment. This is the assessment of the best economists in the country.
He calls it a fiscal wake-up tour, and he is telling civic groups, university forums, and newspaper editorial boards that the U.S. has spent, promised, and borrowed itself into such a deep hole it will be unable to climb out if it doesn't act now.
I just want to repeat, because I don't want any confusion here. I believe that legislation of this enormous magnitude, that by necessity we are moving quickly. We're not moving quickly because we're trying to jam something down people's throats. We're moving quickly because we're told that if we don't move quickly, that the economy is going to keep on getting worse. We'll have another 2 or 3 or 4 million jobs lost this year. I'd love to be leisurely about this. My staff is worn out, working around the clock. So is David Obey's staff. So is Nancy Pelosi's staff. We're not doing this because we think this is a lark. We're doing this because people are counting on us.
As Walker sees it, The survival of the republic is at stake.
When it comes to the Recovery Act, again, every specific provision in it, people like. And so, I think that one of the challenges we had 2 years ago was we had to move so fast. We were in such emergency mode that it was very difficult for us to spend a lot of time doing victory laps and advertising exactly what we were doing because we had to move on to the next thing. And, I take some responsibility for that. I mean, our attitude was we just have to get the policy right. And we did not always think about making sure we were advertising properly what was going on.
Well, here we have a program that CBO has scored as making the Treasury $1 billion over the next 10 years, and yet it could create credit equal to about $300 billion of credit to small businesses. But the Republicans are opposing it. And why is that?
If we do not move swiftly to sign the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act into law, an economy that is already in crisis will be faced with catastrophe.
There's no rational reason unless the goal is to drive the American economy into a double-dip recession.
You feel like, honestly, that Republicans are opposing the policies they're opposing and promoting the policies they're promoting because they want a bad economic outcome?
Well, I didn't come to D.C. as cynical as I feel here a year and a half later as a senator. What I have seen is everything politicized by the primary elections and the general election plan for this year, and it certainly appears that all sense has lost, all sorts of partnership to make American economy work for working Americans is gone.
This is not my assessment. This is not Nancy Pelosi's assessment. This is the assessment of the best economists in the country. This is the assessment of some of the former advisors of some of the same folks who are making these criticisms right now. Millions more Americans will lose their jobs. Homes will be lost. Families will go without health care. Our crippling dependence on foreign oil will continue. That is the price of inaction. This isn't some abstract debate. Last week we learned that many of America's largest corporations already laid off thousands and are planning to lay off tens of thousands of more workers. Today we learned that in the previous week the number of new unemployment claims jumped to 626,000.
At this hour, here are the numbers. About 15 million Americans are out of work, unemployed. 41.8 million Americans are on food stamps. That's hard to say. Think about that. Damn near 42 million Americans are on food stamps. And where are the Republicans? John Boehner is asking, well, where are the jobs? And big business is wasting billions of dollars on themselves. According to the Washington Post, large companies like Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, PepsiCo, and others, well, they're using their massive profits buying back shares instead of investing capital for job creation in this country.
That was Senator Jeff Merkley speaking on this show back in July. That case that he made, you can almost see that it pained him to make it, has stuck with me now for months. I think about what he said there in that segment back in July a lot. The prospect that some of what Congress is doing that is blowing it on the economy is happening on purpose. I think about that a lot. Case in point. There is a program that is part of the stimulus that is credited with creating almost 250,000 American jobs. One program, that many jobs. The overall stimulus in total is on track to create 3.5 million jobs. This one $5 billion program alone is responsible for 250,000 of those jobs. What do you get when you demonstrably create a lot of jobs in an otherwise horrendous economy for relatively little spending? You get a totally not at all controversial program. When CNN did a report recently on this program, they called it the stimulus program even a Republican could love.
The American people know that our challenges are great. They're not expecting Democratic solutions or Republican solutions. They want American solutions. I've said that same thing to the public, and I've said that in a gesture of friendship and goodwill to those who have disagreed with me on aspects of this plan. But what I have also said